What's going on, guys? This is James Allen. I am recording this on Saturday, September 13th, 2025. Yesterday, I realized a massive architectural error in my database, right? In the way I structure the database. That is, every time I need to create a public street pass so that the user could present him or herself to other users, I kept getting that information from the user's document, right? And that's not really a good thing from an engineering standpoint, right? Because you shouldn't have to access the user's personal document in a database to get public information about that user, right? You ideally want to keep the public projection of the user in a separate branch, right? So that you're not touching the user collection a lot, because this is where a lot of sensitive information is stored, right? This is an easy way to create leaks, whether it's the FCM token, user email, whatever sensitive information is in there. Every time you're touching the user document as an engineer, you're creating potentials for leaks. So if the user has a certain amount of information that should be publicly accessible, you should put that in a separate branch so that you're not always tapping into the user's document when you need to fetch public information about the user. Your app will be much more scalable if you follow that practice, and it will also be a lot more safe. Anyway, I realized last night that I had made that mistake. I was getting public information from the user's personal document in the database, and I'm like, okay, I need to change that. So I created a new branch called Street Passes, where that new branch keeps a projection of all the public information that is stored in a user's document, right? So I said to myself, okay, this new branch is where I'm going to get the public information for the user so I could show the street pass to everyone else. However, I'm going to have to do a manual migration to this branch for the users that already exist. And that wasn't too hard, but then I quickly realized that I ran into two challenges, and this is where the episode gets interesting. The first challenge is that I realized is that how do I keep that street pass branch in sync with the user branch, right? Because users will change their picture or they will change their email. Who knows? The user could change any sort of information that is publicly accessible on their street pass, right? So that street pass branch needs to stay in sync with whatever the user is changing in their personal document. So keeping the databases in sync is the first challenge. The second challenge is even more interesting, right? That is, my app is already out there in production. Someone could go download it right now and there wouldn't be a public branch created for that user because I haven't, sent a new version of my app to Google, right? That would reflect these changes in logic. So how do I do it where like any user that signs up for CityXcape right now at this moment would automatically get, a public document created for them under the new Street Pass branch. And if you remember in the last episode, I said, I want to show you how you could use Cloud Functions as the back end, the brain of your mobile application. And this is a perfect use case for that. And I like it like that, where the use case spontaneously emerged. I did not force it. I did not go look for a problem to create a tutorial for you guys. This is a real problem I'm facing as a developer who has an app at production level, startup. This is real startup mistakes, right? So I want to share what I did. This presents a perfect example to use Cloud Functions as the brain of this new architectural decision you've made in the database. And this is exactly what I did. So what I did is I created a Cloud Function that would basically be triggered whenever any write would happen at the user branch. Now, before I go into the solution real quick, right, let me give you a little bit of background so you have something to compare Cloud Functions to. If you remember, during the traditional days, you would have a web backend, right? You would have a web backend with routes, right? And these routes would hit certain endpoints from a client request, right? And when those endpoints are triggered, right, from that route, a function would fire and some logic would be done. So that is a traditional backend. But remember, you just have mobile apps now. We're going lean and mean as startup founders. So we don't have a backend. How do we create a backend without having a backend, right? That's what Cloud Functions are for, because instead of a route, right? Instead of a path that's being hit, that hits an API endpoint and triggers a function, what you could do is use the Cloud Function triggers, because the Cloud Function get triggered by certain actions in your database, right? So you could look at database triggers, and those database triggers will fire a cloud function, which you could then input all the sophisticated backend stuff that you need done. So you basically have a backend without a backend. You're basically using serverless cloud functions as your backend. So here is my specific example. I created a cloud function called mirroring street pass or something like that. I think that's what I call it. Mirroring street pass, I believe, and if you look at that function, so I'm going off the top of my head, right? I don't have the notes in my hand or anything. So off the top of my head, this is what I remember I've written. So I created a trigger at the user's path, right? So any unwrite trigger, so any write operation that happened at the user document branch, it will trigger that particular cloud function, the mirror street pass cloud function. Okay, then what's next? Once those points in the database, once a write operation triggers that cloud function, the first thing I do is I capture the user ID, and I also capture the data after the change, right? Any one of you know JavaScript, Node.js specifically, you could compare data before and after. There's methods for that. So I basically did a method where I get the database change, I get the data after it's changed, right? And then the first thing I look for is the data deleted, right? That's the natural thing. So if the user delete their account, for an example, this block would become true. So then if the data is deleted, well, delete the data on the street pass public branch as well. Because we're supposed to mirror what's happening at the user's personal account without touching that user document, right? So, okay, if the user delete their account, right, delete the street pass public branch as well for that user, public document for that user as well. Okay, but if it's not deleted, right, it would just skip this block altogether if it's not deleted. Then what's next? Well, what's next is you have the data that's changed, right? You have the changed data. Now create that projection, right? So this is me basically creating that projection, and I'm making sure if the data is not changed, it's still in that projection, right? And then if it is changed, it would basically unwrap, and there you go, right? So any change that is reflected would be also shown in that data projection. And then the classic thing is I set the data in the new document, or, I update the document. I don't know if you see set equal true here. So it's basically saying update any value if the document exists. And then boom, whenever the user changes their email, whenever the user changes their images or whatever they do, that street pass branch is automatically updated because of the trigger that I did with the cloud function. And more importantly, any user that joins CityXcape right now without a new push being, I didn't even push a new version to Apple or Google, any user that comes right now will still be migrated, will still be mirrored to that public branch, because cloud functions could be deployed like that. You don't need to go through Apple or Google, because it's technically a backend. It's a serverless backend, so you could just deploy it with a Firebase command, and then there you go. All the new users still get the new architectural benefit without me having to push a single version to Apple or Google. So I hope this makes sense, because this is a real life use case that happened. Nothing of that is made up or acted. I'm giving it to you raw and uncut. So I hope this helps my misfits. In any case, you know what to do. Don't forget to press that like button and support me on Patreon. I will see you next time.